The year was 1961. The United States was in the midst of a fierce space race against the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy's famous speech had just declared the ambitious goal. The United States would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The world watched, waiting for the first steps that would mark humanity's leap into the stars. For the NASA team, this was more than a mission. It was a symbol of American ingenuity and hope. But behind the ambition lay intense pressure and doubt. Would they be able to pull it off? The Apollo program was born out of necessity, with millions of dollars in funding and the best minds working on something never attempted before. The first steps weren't easy. The early missions faced failures, like the Apollo 1 tragedy that cost the lives of 3 astronauts in a fire during a routine test. The loss shook the nation, but the resolve to continue only strengthened. The stakes were high. If Apollo 11 succeeded, it would be a victory not just for America, but for all humanity. As the Apollo program advanced, the names of the astronauts began to take shape. The 3 men chosen for Apollo 11 were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Each of them had their own unique background and personality, but all shared the same drive to succeed. Neil Armstrong, the commander, was a quiet, focused man who had already proven himself as a skilled pilot. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he was the one chosen to make history. Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, was determined and energetic. He had trained in various space missions, and he was ready to step onto the moon. Michael Collins, a command module pilot, was less well-known but just as important. His job was to stay in lunar orbit aboard the command module, Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface below. The crew formed a bond during their training, but deep down, they all felt the weight of the mission. They had no idea just how dangerous it could get, but they were ready to give everything for the mission to succeed. The countdown began. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was ready for launch. The eyes of the world were on Kennedy Space Center as the giant Saturn V rocket stood ready to take off. As the seconds ticked down, a nervous excitement filled the air. This was a culmination of years of work, and everything had to go perfectly. For Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, this was a moment they had been training for. But as they strapped themselves into the spacecraft, there was no turning back. The rocket's engines roared to life, and Apollo 11 soared into the sky, leaving the Earth behind. The mission was anything but easy. Early in the flight, there were concerns about the spacecraft systems, and the astronauts knew they couldn't afford even the slightest mistake. The stakes were enormous, and there was no room for failure. As Apollo 11 approached the moon, the tension reached a fever pitch. The crew was about to make history, but it wasn't as simple as just landing. Armstrong and Aldrin were tasked with piloting the lunar module Eagle to the surface, while Collins remained in orbit. They encountered problems with the landing system. The lunar module was descending, but the computer was guiding them toward a rocky, boulder-strewn area. Armstrong's quick thinking saved the mission. He manually took control of the spacecraft, guiding it to a safer spot. As the Eagle touched down on the moon's surface, Armstrong's words echoed in history. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." But their troubles weren't over. The moon's surface was more treacherous than anyone expected. The astronauts had to deal with harsh conditions, including low gravity and the threat of dangerous moon dust. The mission was far from smooth sailing, but the worst was yet to come. Neil Armstrong was the first to step onto the moon. As his boot made contact with the dusty surface, he famously said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." For a moment, the entire world held its breath. The unimaginable had happened. Humans were walking on the moon. Buzz Aldrin followed shortly after, and the 2 astronauts began exploring the lunar surface. They set up experiments, took photographs, and collected rock samples. It was the achievement of a lifetime. But as they worked, they knew they couldn't afford to be distracted by the gravity of the moment. They had a limited time to complete their mission. Meanwhile, Collins remained in the command module, orbiting the moon alone. He was the unsung hero, keeping the spacecraft ready for their return. While Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface, Collins was equally vital to their safe return. After spending several hours on the moon, Armstrong, and Aldrin returned to the lunar module and began their journey back to Columbia. As the two spacecraft docked, the realization set in: the mission was a success, but the journey back wasn't easy. The astronauts had to make sure their systems worked properly for the long trip home. They were exhausted, having spent days in space and on the moon, but they couldn't relax until they safely re-entered Earth's atmosphere. As the crew entered Earth's atmosphere, the heat shield of the command module glowed red hot as it entered at thousands of miles per hour. The astronauts braced themselves for the roughest part of the mission. The spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, and they were picked up by the USS Hornet, marking the safe return of Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was more than a successful mission. It was a testament to human determination, resilience, and the power of teamwork. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins had faced countless obstacles, but they succeeded because they never gave up. When they returned to Earth, they were greeted as heroes. The entire world celebrated their success. But for Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, the journey wasn't about fame. It was about fulfilling a promise made to the world. They had not just landed on the moon. They had united humanity in a way no one could have imagined. In the years that followed, Apollo 11's legacy lived on. It inspired generations of scientists, engineers, and dreamers to aim higher. While no human has returned to the moon since, the Apollo program opened the door for future missions. Apollo 11 wasn't just a mission to the moon. It was a mission to the stars, and its story continues to inspire the world to reach for the impossible.